The Hitchcockian Cut. Montage. Montage is usually conceived as a way of producing from fragments of the real, pieces of film, discontinuous individual shots, an effect of cinematic space, i.e., a specific cinematic reality. That is to say, it is universally acknowledged that cinematic space is never a simple repetition or imitation of external effective reality, but an effect of montage. What is often overlooked, however, is the way this transformation of fragments of the real into cinematic reality produces, through a kind of structural necessity, a certain leftover, a surplus that is radically heterogeneous to cinematic reality, but nonetheless implied by it, part of it. That this surplus of the real is, in the last resort, precisely the gaze qua object, is best exemplified by the work of Hitchcock. We have already pointed out that the fundamental constituent of the Hitchcockian universe is the so-called spot, the stain upon which reality revolves, passes over into the real, the mysterious detail that sticks out, that does not fit into the symbolic network of reality, and that, as such, indicates that something is amiss. The fact that this spot ultimately coincides with the threatening gaze of the other is confirmed in an almost too obvious way by the famous tennis court scene from Strangers on a Train, in which Guy watches the crowd watching the game. The camera first gives us a long shot of the crowd. All heads turn alternately left and right, following the path of the ball, all except one, which stares with a fixed gaze into the camera, i.e., at Guy. The camera then quickly approaches this motionless head. It is Bruno, linked to Guy by a murderous pact. Here we have, in pure, distilled form, the stiff, motionless gaze sticking out like a strange body, and thus disturbing the harmony of the image by introducing a threatening dimension. The function of the famous Hitchcockian tracking shot is precisely to produce a spot. In the tracking shot, the camera moves from an establishing shot to a close-up of a detail that remains a blurred spot, the true form of which is accessible only to an anamorphotic view from a side. The shot slowly isolates from its surroundings the element that cannot be integrated into the symbolic reality, that must remain a strange body if the depicted reality is to retain its consistency. But what interests us here is the fact that under certain conditions, montage does intervene in the tracking shot, i.e., the continuous approach of the camera is interrupted by cuts. What, more precisely, are these conditions? Briefly, the tracking shot must be interrupted when it is subjective, when the camera shows us the subjective view of a person approaching the object spot. That is to say, whenever in a Hitchcock film a hero, a person around whom the scene is structured, approaches an object, a thing, another person, anything that can become uncanny, unheimlich in the Freudian sense, Hitchcock, as a rule, alternates the objective shot of this person in motion, his/her approach toward the uncanny thing, with a subjective shot of what this person sees, i.e., with a subjective view of the thing. This is, so to speak, the elementary procedure, the 0 degree of Hitchcockian montage. Let us take a few examples. When, toward the end of Psycho, Lila climbs up the rise to the mysterious old house, the presumed home of Norman's mother, Hitchcock alternates the objective shot of Lila climbing with her subjective view of the old house. He does the same in The Birds, in the famous scene analyzed in detail by Raymond Bellour, when Melanie, after crossing the bay in a small rented boat, approaches the house where Mitch's mother and sister live. Again, he alternates an objective shot of the uneasy Melanie, aware of intruding on the privacy of a home, with her subjective view of the mysteriously silent house. Of innumerable other examples, let us mention merely a short, trivial scene between Marion and a car dealer in Psycho. Here, Hitchcock uses his montage procedure several times. When Marion approaches the car dealer, when, towards the end of the scene, a policeman approaches who has already stopped her on the highway the same morning, etc. By means of this purely formal procedure, an entirely trivial, everyday incident is given an uneasy, threatening dimension that cannot be sufficiently explained by its diegetic contents, i.e., by the fact that Marion is buying a new car with stolen money and thus fears exposure. Hitchcockian montage elevates an everyday trivial object into a sublime thing. By purely formal manipulation, it succeeds in bestowing on an ordinary object the aura of anxiety and uneasiness. In Hitchcockian montage, two kinds of shots are thus permitted, and two forbidden. Permitted are the objective shot of the person approaching a thing, and the subjective shot presenting the thing as the person sees it. Forbidden are the objective shot of the thing, of the uncanny object, and, above all, the subjective shot of the approaching person from the perspective of the uncanny object itself. Let us refer again to the above-mentioned scene from Psycho depicting Lila approaching the house on the top of the hill. It is crucial that Hitchcock shows the threatening thing, the house, exclusively from the point of view of Lila. If he were to have added a neutral objective shot of the house, the whole mysterious effect would have been lost. We, the spectators, would have to endure a radical desublimation. We would suddenly become aware that there is nothing uncanny in the house as such. That the house is, like the black house in the Patricia Highsmith short story, just an ordinary old house. The effect of uneasiness would be radically psychologized. We would say to ourselves, this is just an ordinary house. All the mystery and anxiety attached to it are just an effect of the heroine's psychic turmoil. The effect of uncanniness would also be lost if Hitchcock had immediately added a shot subjectifying the thing, i.e., a subjective shot from inside the house. Let us imagine that as Lila approached the house, there had been a trembling shot showing Lila through the curtains of the house window, accompanied by the sound of hollow breathing, thus indicating that somebody was watching her from inside the house. Such a procedure, used regularly in standard thrillers, would, of course, intensify the strain. We would say to ourselves, this is terrible. There is somebody in the house, Norman's mother, watching Lila. She is in mortal danger without knowing it. But such a subjectification would again suspend the status of the gaze qua object, reducing it to the subjective point of view of another diegetic personality. Sergei Eisenstein himself once risked such a direct subjectification in a scene from The Old and the New, a film that celebrated the successes of the collectivization of Soviet agriculture in the late 1920s. It is a somewhat Lysenkoist scene, demonstrating the way nature finds pleasure in subordinating itself to the new rules of collective farming, the way even cows and bulls mate more ardently once they are included in kilkotzes. In a quick trading shot, the camera approaches a cow from behind, and in the next shot it becomes clear that this view of the camera was the view of a bull mounting a cow. Needless to say, the effect of the scene is so obscenely vulgar that it is almost nauseating. What we have here is a kind of Stalinist pornography. It would be wiser, then, to turn away from this Stalinist obscenity to the Hollywood decency of Hitchcock. Let us return to the scene from Psycho in which Lila approaches the house, where Norman's mother presumably lives. In what does its uncanny dimension consist? Could we not best describe the effect of the scene by paraphrasing the words of Lacan? In a way, is it already the house that gazes at Lila? Lila sees the house, but nonetheless she cannot see it at the point from which it gazes back at her. Here, the situation is the same as that which Lacan recollects from his youth and reports in Seminar 11. As a student on holiday, he joined a fishing expedition. Among the fishermen on the boat, there was a certain Petit Jean who, pointing out an empty sardine can glittering in the sun, asked Lacan, "You see the can? Do you see it?" "Well, it doesn't see you." Lacan's comments, if what Petit Jean said to me, namely that the can did not see me, had any meaning, it was because in a sense it was looking at me all the same. It was looking at him because, as Lacan explains, using a key notion of the Hitchcockian universe, I functioned somewhat like a spot in the picture. Among these uneducated fishermen earning their living with great difficulty, He was effectively out of place, the man who knew too much. The death drive. The examples we have analysed thus far were purposely elementary. Let us conclude them with an analysis of a scene in which the Hitchcockian montage is part of a more complex whole. The scene from Sabotage, in which Sylvia Sidney kills Oskar Homolka. The two characters are dining together at home. Sylvia is still in a state of shock, having learned recently that Oskar, her husband, is a saboteur guilty of the death of her younger brother, who was blown up by a bomb on a bus. When Sylvia brings the vegetable platter to the table, the knife on the platter acts as a magnet. It is almost as if her hand, against her will, were compelled to grab it, yet she cannot resolve herself finally to do so. Oskar, who up till now has pursued banal, everyday table conversation, perceives that she is spellbound by the knife, and what this augurs for him. He stands up and walks round the table toward her. When they are face to face, he reaches for the knife, but, unable to complete the gesture, lets her grab it. The camera then moves in closer, showing only their faces and shoulders, so that it is not clear what is happening with their hands. Suddenly, Oskar utters a short cry and falls down, without our knowing whether she stabbed him, or he, in a suicidal gesture, impaled himself on the blade. The first thing that deserves notice is the way the act of murder results from the encounter of two thwarted, threatening gestures. Both Sylvia's move forward with the knife and Oskar's move toward it correspond to the Lacanian definition of the threatening gesture. It is not an interrupted gesture, i.e., a gesture that is intended to be carried out, to be completed, but is thwarted by an external obstacle. It is, on the contrary, something that was already begun in order not to be accomplished, not to be brought to its conclusion. The very structure of the threatening gesture is thus that of a theatrical, hysterical act, a split, self-hindered gesture, a gesture that cannot be accomplished not because of some external obstacle, but because it is in itself the expression of a contradictory, self-conflicting desire. In this case, Sylvia's desire to stab Oskar, and at the same time the prohibition that blocks the realization of this desire. Oskar's move, when, after becoming aware of her intention, he stands up and comes forward to meet her, is again contradictory, split into his self-preserving desire to snatch the knife from her and master it, and his masochistic desire to offer himself to the stab of the knife, a desire conditioned by his morbid feeling of guilt. The successful act, the stabbing of Oskar, results thus from the encounter of two failed, hindered, split acts. Her desire to stab him is met by his own desire to be punished and ultimately killed. Apparently, Oskar moves forward to defend himself, but this move is at the same time supported by the desire to be stabbed, so that, in the end, it is of no importance which of the two really carried out the crucial gesture. Did she push the knife in, or did he throw himself on the blade? The murder results from the overlap, the coincidence of her desire with his. In relation to the structural place of Oskar's masochistic desire, we should refer to the logic of fantasy, elaborated by Freud in A Child is Being Beaten. Freud explains here how the final form of the fantasy scene, a child is being beaten, presupposes two previous phases. The first, sadistic phase, is my father is beating the child, my brother, somebody who is my rival double. The second is its masochistic inversion, I am being beaten by my father, while the third and final form of the fantasy renders indistinct, neutralizes the subject, who is doing the beating, as well as the object, what child is being beaten. In the impersonal, a child is being beaten. According to Freud, the crucial role belongs to the second, masochistic phase. This is where the real trauma lies. This is the phase that is radically repressed. We find no trace of it in the child's fantasizing. We can only construct it retroactively on the basis of clues pointing to the fact that there is something missing between my father is beating the child and a child is being beaten. Because we cannot transform the first form into the third, definite one, Freud reasons that intermediate form must intervene. The second phase is the most important and the most momentous of all, but we may say of it that in a certain sense it has never had a real existence. It is never remembered, it has never succeeded in becoming conscious. It is a construction of analysis, but it is no less a necessity on that account. The second form of the fantasy is thus the Lacanian real, a point that never took place in symbolic reality, that has never been inscribed in the symbolic texture, but that must nonetheless be presupposed as a kind of missing link, guaranteeing the consistency of our symbolic reality. Our thesis is that Hitchcockian murders, in addition to Oscar's death in Sabotage, let us mention at least the final fall of the saboteur from the Statue of Liberty in Saboteur and Gromek's murder in Torn Curtain, are governed by a homologous fantasy logic. The first phase is always sadistic. It consists in our identification with the hero who finally gets the opportunity to have done with the villain. We cannot wait to see Sylvia finish the evil Oscar, to see the decent American push the Nazi saboteur over the railing, to see Paul Newman get rid of Gromek, etc. The final phase is, of course, the compassionate inversion. When we see that the villain is really a helpless, broken being, we are overwhelmed with compassion and guilt. We are punished for our previous sadistic desire. In Saboteur, the hero tries desperately to save the villain suspended by his sleeve, the seams of which tear one by one. In Sabotage, Sylvia compassionately embraces the dying Oscar, preventing him from hitting the floor. In Torn Curtain, the very long duration of the act of murder, the clumsiness of Paul Newman, and the desperate resistance of the victim render the whole affair extremely painful, barely supportable. At first, it may seem that it is possible to pass directly from the first to the final phase of the fantasy, i.e., from sadistic pleasure at the imminent destruction of the villain to a sense of guilt and compassion. But if this were all, Hitchcock would be simply a kind of moralist presenting us with the price to be paid for our sadistic desire. You wanted the villain to be killed, now you've got it and must suffer the consequences. There is in Hitchcock, however, always an intermediate phase. The sadistic desire for the villain to be killed is followed by a sudden awareness that it is actually the villain himself who is, in a stifled but nonetheless unequivocal way, disgusted with his own corruption and wants to be delivered from this unbearable pressure through his own punishment and death. This is the delicate moment in which we become aware that the hero's, and thus the spectator's, desire to annihilate the villain is already the desire of the villain himself. In Sabotage, for example, it is the moment at which it becomes clear that Sylvia's desire to stab Oscar overlaps with Oscar's desire to exculpate himself via his own death. This constant implicit presence of a tendency to self-annihilation, of an enjoyment found in provoking one's own ruin, in short of the death drive, is what bestows upon the Hitchcockian villain his ambiguous charm. And it is at the same time what prevents us from passing immediately from the initial sadism to a final compassion for the villain. This compassion is based upon an awareness that the villain himself experiences his guilt and wants to die. In other words, our compassion arises only when we become aware of the ethical attitude contained in the villain's subjective position. What, however, has all this to do with Hitchcockian montage? In this final scene of Sabotage, although Sylvia is its emotional center, she is nevertheless the scene's object. Oscar is its subject. That is to say, it is his subjective perspective that articulates the rhythm of the scene. In the beginning, Oscar pursues the usual dinner conversation and entirely fails to notice Sylvia's extreme inattention. When she becomes transfixed by the knife, the astonished Oscar glances at her and becomes aware of her desire. This introduces the first scansion. The empty chatter comes to a halt as it becomes clear to Oscar what Sylvia is contemplating. Thereupon, he stands up and steps forward to meet her. This part of the action is shot in the manner of Hitchcockian montage, i.e., the camera first shows us Oscar approaching Sylvia around the table, and then Oscar's view of the paralyzed, inflexible Sylvia, staring at him in desperation, as if asking him to help her make up her mind. When they find themselves face to face, he is himself paralyzed and lets her grab the knife. Then we are given a shot of their exchange of glances, i.e., we do not see what is going on below their waists. Suddenly, he utters an incomprehensible cry. Next shot, a close-up of her hand holding the knife, stabbed deep into his chest. Thereupon she embraces him, as in an act of compassion, before he collapses to the floor. So he helped her indeed. By moving close to her, he let her know that he has accepted her desire as his own, i.e., that he also wants to die. No wonder then that afterward Sylvia embraces him compassionately. He has, so to speak, met her halfway. He has delivered her from unbearable tension. The moment of Hitchcockian montage, the moment at which Oscar advances toward Sylvia, is thus the moment at which Oscar accepts her desire as his own, or, to refer to the Lacanian definition of the hysteric's desire as the desire of the other, the moment at which Oscar is hystericized. When we see Sylvia through Oscar's eyes, in the subjective shot of the camera approaching her, we witness the moment at which Oscar becomes aware that her desire overlaps his own, i.e., that he himself yearns to die, the moment at which he takes upon himself the lethal gaze of the other.